Okay, so in this video, we're going to go over a few unique 19th century nationalisms. So both of these things are products of the 19th century and specific things that happened during the 19th century. So the first one of these that we're going to go over is American international imperialism. So we've discussed how the United States is a imperial power in North America. But towards the end of the 19th century, the United States starts building a global empire as well. Some of this has to do with the idea being that they want to keep up with their European economic rivals. Now, while they did not get involved in African imperialism, even though they did send an observer to the Berlin Conference. They did want to have some international colonies. In fact, the poem, The White Man's Burden, was written to encourage American colonization efforts. This desire to take colonies was also driven by the idea of manifest destiny. Now, we've talked about manifest destiny before, but here there's the practical side to it. It's hard to ship things, or especially big things, from the east coast of the United States to the west coast and the easiest way to send something big is to put it on a boat, but that takes a long time to sail all the way around South America to get to the west or east coasts. So there were a couple of things that the Americans did to help with these desires. The first one of these is the Panama Canal. So the Panama Canal was built through a piece of Colombia that was called Panama. So Panama was a province of Colombia, and the Americans asked the Colombians if they could build a canal through their region, their province of Panama. And the Colombians said no. So the Americans helped Panama declare independence, and then the Americans asked Panama to build a canal, and they said yes. So now the United States controls this shortcut between the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. And eventually, it was given back to Panama. The other desire for overseas colonies occurred with the Spanish-American War. In 1898. So the idea behind this war was that the United States wanted to get into the Cuban sugar market. But the Spanish cut them out. So the Americans through journalists accusing someone of blowing up an American ship in Havana Harbor. Now, this is a pretty famous incident. The ship was the USS Maine, and it blew up in Havana Harbor. American journalists said somebody blew it up, probably the Spanish. Most recent investigations said it was just an accident, that one of the engines exploded. It was just an accident. But the journalists, kind of wanting to cover a war, accused someone of blowing it up, and that caused the Americans to declare war on Spain. War on Spain. Now, by this point, the Spanish were not a major power anymore. And the Americans pretty quickly detached all the remaining colonies from Spain. So included in here was Cuba, which was given independence with American help in the sugar industry. But on top of that, the United States got the Philippines, Puerto Rico, and the island of Guam out in the Pacific Ocean. So now, like the other industrialized powers, the United States now has a larger global footprint, just like the British and the French and the Japanese. The Americans now have an empire across the world. The other unique 19th century nationalism is Jewish nationalism. And this is also called Zionism. Now, Jewish nationalism or Zionism arises out of European anti-Semitism, which we've been talking about pretty much since the beginning of the course. So, Jews have always been seen as a scapegoat, mostly because they were an other in a homogeneous Christian society. So just about everybody in Europe was Christian, and the few Jewish people that lived in Europe were convenient scapegoats whenever something would go wrong. And so anti-Semitism always kind of existed. It existed as long as Christianity has been in Europe, or the Jews left their homeland and spread out throughout Eurasia. Anti-Semitism followed. Now, the nationalism of the 19th century made the anti-Semitism more entrenched. Like it wasn't going anywhere now. The nationalism of the 19th century made anti-Semitism something that was not going to go away. There wasn't as much violence, although there still was some. But the differences between Jews and non-Jews were more pronounced. It became very apparent if you were Jewish, you weren't practicing the same nationalism as everybody else. You might be 90% French, but if you're also not Catholic, you're not 100% French. And so you may be very French, but you're still going to stick out a little bit. The turning point here, the thing that makes Zionism into a thing, is a French court case called the Dreyfus Affair. Okay, so the Dreyfus Affair was a court case in France. And in this case, a French Jewish army captain named Albert Dreyfus was accused of sharing military secrets with Germany. Now, he didn't do it, but somebody did share the secrets. During the trial, it became obvious that Dreyfus was innocent. But he was convicted anyway. And sentenced to life in prison on a prison island in South America called Devil's Island. So, not a great place to be sentenced to. And it became pretty apparent that the only reason he was convicted was because he was Jewish. And this splintered French society. And a lot of people were outraged about the result. But maybe more distressing are the number of people that supported the result, but there was a large outcry from people who were upset that this happened. This was an obvious miscarriage of justice, and this was not fair. And we get out of this maybe the most famous headline of all time in a newspaper. The French author, and maybe the most famous French person at the time, Emile Zola, wrote an essay that was published in all the French newspapers. And it was titled J'accuse, which means I accuse you. And the point of this essay, the argument that he's making, is that the French government was anti-Semitic. That was the point he was making. Zola was actually put on trial for libel because he didn't really have any proof of this. And he was convicted. But Zola was successful in getting Dreyfus a new trial. And he was convicted again. But this time he was pardoned by the French president. And this happened in 1899. Now, the point of the Dreyfus Affair, the reason we bring this up, is because watching the Dreyfus Affair was a Jewish journalist. So a Hungarian Jewish journalist. His name was Theodore Herzl. He was there covering the trial in Paris. But he came to the realization that Jews would never be safe in Europe. And they needed a homeland outside of Europe. And this is what Zionism is trying to do, is trying to find a homeland for the Jews outside of Europe, a place where they could be safe. And there were a number of ideas that were thrown around. Madagascar was one of these ideas. This was the original idea of the Nazis, was to put the Jews in Madagascar. Uganda was another possibility. Stalin offered up a big piece of Siberia. But the Jewish people didn't want these. They wanted Palestine, which was their original homeland, like 2,500 years ago. They wanted Palestine. Palestine belonged to the Ottomans. In 1917, in the middle of World War I, the British agreed to support a Jewish homeland in Palestine after the war. And this became known as the Balfour Declaration. And eventually, Israel will be created in 1947. Now, this leads to a number of other issues, such as what about all of the people who already live in Palestine? But we'll worry about that when we get into the next time period and we start worrying about the issues of decolonization. But for right now, we're done with this topic, and this is Mr. Nissen signing off.